IRS first said that there was no targeting of political groups. Then it said that it was a few rogue agents in Cincinnati. Then it said that there was also equal scrutinization of progressive groups. All of those things have been now proved untrue. Now it's saying that these Lois Lerner emails have been lost forever because of a hard drive crash. And then only when asked, the IRS disclosed that 6 other hard drives belonging to IRS officials being investigated had also crashed. Given all that history, do you personally believe that crash, quote unquote, was truly an accident and a coincidence?
Senator, I don't agree with the history that you recited. I think there's no evidence that's come forward to show any political involvement in the whole 501c4 decisions. I think that the actions taken by this administration and by myself have been clear that we need to replace the people who made decisions in senior positions.
Mr. Secretary, do you personally believe that this hard drive crash was both an accident and a coincidence?
Senator, I have no reason to believe that it's not just a hard drive that broke. Hard drives do break.
Okay, so you believe it was an accident and a coincidence?
Look, I know that in 2011, when the hard drive broke, it was reported. There was an attempt made to reconstruct it. It was a hard drive that broke.
You believe it was an accident and a coincidence, basically, according to your testimony before, because folks at the IRS told you that?
Senator, sometimes a broken hard drive is just a broken hard drive.
But you don't understand the fact that the American people think somebody other than folks at the IRS should look into this?
Look,
doesn't that make fundamental sense?
I defer to the IRS commissioner who's addressed this at great length. They have and will continue to respond to questions.
When's the last time a hard drive broke like this at the IRS?
I don't know, Senator.
So you haven't asked that question?
I do know that hard drives periodically break.
Do you know if it's ever happened before, say, in the last 10 years at the IRS?
Senator, I'm not an IT expert. I'd have to get our IT expert.
And you haven't asked that question?
Senator, I do know that hard drives break. They break in the Congress, they break in agencies, they break in our homes. And when a hard drive breaks, you try to recover what you can. What the IRS has done is gone above and beyond, in terms of reaching out not just to the broken hard drive.
Mr. Secretary, the point is nobody trusts the IRS to be the only person looking at this issue. It's a fundamental point. No one thinks only the folks who could get in trouble over it should investigate it. You don't think that's a fair response? Because that's certainly the dominant response of the American people.
Senator, I think that the IRS has gone through a thorough review. They made a report to the Congress. They're testifying, answering questions. And
let me ask it this way. When a taxpayer files a tax return and takes a bunch of deductions and the IRS asks questions about those deductions and the taxpayer has no receipts, no documentation of the deductions because the dog ate them, should the IRS accept that?
Well, actually,
any further outside investigation?
The IRS policy, when a taxpayer has lost information because of something like a broken hard drive, is to work with the taxpayer to recover what can be recovered and to make determinations based on the data that's available.
That's interesting. I think there are going to be a lot of broken hard drives happening in the next few months, so I'd warn the IRS about that. An archivist at of the United States testified yesterday that the IRS didn't follow the law when it failed to report the loss of records belonging to a senior IRS executive. What consequences will there be for that failure?
Senator, the IRS IG is looking at this whole matter, so there are independent eyes being put on it, and I would defer to the IRS IG those matters. Also,
a number of IT professionals disagree that these emails are unrecoverable. What, if anything, are you doing to bring those professionals in to the process?
Senator, I'm happy to take back any questions that arise. I am not, as I say, not an IT professional. I have been told that extraordinary steps have been taken to recover the data.
I just want to emphasize, Mr. Secretary, that in the real world, when I talk to folks in Louisiana, Democrat, Republican, Independent, their reaction to the notion that this is a pure accident and coincidence ranges from some who are very, very dubious to most who think that that assertion is laughable. And this is growing the distrust gap enormously between Washington and the American people. Something needs to be done about it.
Well, Senator, I obviously don't disagree that it's unfortunate that the hard drive broke. I'm answering your questions. The IRS is answering questions. It was from 2011 when the hard drive broke until now, every effort has been made to recover. And
the only folks looking into it work at the IRS. The only folks.
Well, no, the IG
work
is
at the IRS.
Senator, the IG is looking into it.
Senator Warren, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. You know, Mr. Secretary, there are two tools to address the ongoing too big to fail problem. We could address the to fail part by trying to eliminate all the different ways that massive financial institutions could take on too much risk, or we could address the too big part of it by breaking up the biggest banks so that even if they did take on too much risk, we could let them fail without worrying that they would bring down the whole economy. Now, Dodd-Frank focused principally on the first approach, trying to address the sources of risk in the system. But since Congress enacted that law, the risks have changed. Banks have gotten more involved in the ownership and trading of physical commodities like aluminum and oil and gas. They've started offering securities backed by subprime auto loans, which look an awful lot like the subprime mortgage-backed securities that caused the 2008 crisis. It seems like we're playing a game of whack-a-mole. As we address some sources of risk, others start popping up. So my question is, given how quickly the amount and types of risk change for these massive financial institutions and how difficult it is for regulators to master these new challenges, how confident are you that we can solve the too big to fail problem by focusing only on regulating risk rather than using a combination of regulating risk and reducing size?
Senator, I actually think that size doesn't always correlate with risk. You could have a smaller institution that creates more risk.
So, let me just stop you there, Mr. Secretary, just because you and I have had this conversation before. And this part of it we can just rehearse very quickly by saying the question is not whether it always correlates. The question is whether or not a large institution that takes on more risk poses more risk to the economy than a smaller institution that takes on more risk. And it's a question of using one tool, that is, you're just trying to manage risk, or using two tools, that risk and size matter.
Senator, I think that if you look at the approach we've taken, it is, and not, when I say we, I don't mean just Treasury, but the regulators have taken, it imposes substantial burdens on large firms by requiring higher capital reserves, by putting tougher standards in place. So there hasn't been an ignoring of size. It's been to impose internalized costs to reduce the risk. Now, whether there is more that needs to be done is something we need to continue to
But, Mr. Secretary, what's been the consequence of your having imposed these, as you put them, costs on size? We have watched over the last 5 years, the largest financial institutions have gotten substantially larger. So it's not that these tools have been effective to reduce the size. They've grown.
Well, they also have much higher capital reserves, and they're in a position that is not the same as the position they were in at the beginning of the process. I mean, at some level, if the price of being big means having larger capital reserves and you can build in more protections, the question, which I think is a fair question, is that enough? But the approach taken has not been to ignore size, is what I'm saying.
Well, all right, but they have gotten bigger. So whatever you're doing is obviously not causing them to get smaller, and that adds additional risk. So let me ask the question then a different way. I know that the Treasury Department has supported the big banks and objected to steps that would reduce their size, such as imposing asset caps or reinstituting Glass-Steagall. But the GAO will release a report shortly on whether the big banks continue to profit from their too big to fail status. Now, if that report confirms that too big to fail is still a serious problem, will the department rethink its opposition and support taking steps directly to rein in the size of the biggest financial institutions?
Senator, I look forward to reading that report and other analyses of the issue, because obviously it is an important question whether there is a funding advantage. And the data, as we've discussed many times, is imperfect and not as current as we would all like. And we are always looking at what we can do to make our financial system safer and sounder. You know, my reluctance to directly answer the question about kind of setting arbitrary size limits is that I worry that is perhaps misses the real risks, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Well, I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary. You know, you said yesterday, and I will close here since I'm over time, but you said yesterday in testimony before the House that we won't really know whether we've solved the too big to fail until there's another crisis. I hope that doesn't mean that nothing will change your mind on the question of addressing the fact that the biggest financial institutions in this country are getting bigger by the day, and that size intersects with risk. And believing that we are using only one tool, and that is trying to regulate the risk without paying attention to size, I think runs some enormous risks. I know I don't have to remind you, we can't afford another financial meltdown, and these big banks pose a risk to the entire economy.
Senator, I think that there shouldn't be a day when we don't look forward at what the risks of the future are and challenge our assumptions that we've come to today with, and ask, do we have the tools we need for the future? That's how I approach every issue, and we have to rethink things. So I don't have views that are locked in based on the past, but I do think that if you look at what we've been doing, we've been keeping a focus on where we think the risks are the greatest. So we're keeping a lot of pressure on the regulators to act on shadow banking. We're keeping a lot of pressure on the international system to meet U.S. capital standards, so our exposure is not so great in our complex global financial system. And I look forward to continuing to look at all these issues.
I appreciate that. I appreciate your willingness to consider and reconsider the impact of size, and also to continue to take a very hard look. These banks are taking on new forms of risk.
Yeah,
I apologize.
I know that you're over time and I'm over time, but I actually think size is not necessarily the only issue. Complexity is an issue that may be more important than size.
Hence the reason to use two tools and not just one.
But I don't think that leads to an arbitrary limit that would not necessarily deal with that problem.
Any ways to deal with size without calling it an arbitrary limit? I will not let him get the last word. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Heller.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and to the Secretary, thank you for being here also. I want to begin by saying that I don't share your confidence in Commissioner Koskin. I've been here for 7.5 years. I've never seen a more arrogant witness in my time here, and coming from a city that breeds arrogance, that's really saying something. I want to begin by following up with Senator Moran and Senator Vitter's questions on the IRS scandal. Before I do so, I'd like to start with a quote from the President last year that said, the IRS has to operate with absolute integrity, and the government has to conduct itself in a way that is true to the public trust. And I would argue that this administration has completely failed on every single one of those points, and I think there are many here in this room that would agree with me. Going back to Senator Moran's questions and being very specific, Senator Lew, when were you first personally aware? When were you first personally aware that Lois Lerner's emails were lost?
Senators, as I testified yesterday, I became aware of it roughly at the time Congress did, just days before. Our attorneys were talking to each other, and I think correctly said that they should fully understand the whole situation and then bring it forward and disclose it completely. And
so they found out in April and didn't tell you till You heard it on TV?
No, no, I said I learned just before.